Anyone who knew John List all reacted the same way, that how could he have done this? Why did he do it?
I felt that even though I killed the family, I could still get forgiveness eventually from God.
I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man.
Bob is John List.
December 7th, 1971. Christmas was just around the corner, and winter was approaching its peak in Westfield, New Jersey. As the residents of the town were in a festive mood awaiting the holidays, their merriness was overshadowed by feelings of pure fear and horror on that chilly December night. When the Westfield locals observed no activity for a month in and around the Breeze Knoll mansion, home to the religious List family, they decided to inform the authorities. When the police arrived to look into the issue, they discovered the brutally murdered bodies of 5 out of the 6 List family members. The morbid crime left the whole country in shock. What happened that fateful night? Who and where was the 6th member of the List family? Welcome to Mysterious 7, where we bring you history's most mysterious crime stories. Today, we'll be looking into the case with the most insane twists, the case of the List family. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please hit the like and subscribe buttons for more such content. Now, without any further ado, let's dive into the case. Westfield, New Jersey is a classic town for modern families. Noted for its beautiful downtown area, excellent school system, and convenient commute to New York City, it offers residents the attractions of fine suburban living with an easy route to metropolitan New York. The Victorian and colonial-style homes and the broad tree-lined streets highlight the town's historic character. The peaceful landscape also inhabits lush parks and golf courses, and an endless array of recreational facilities for children as well as adults. Westfield is a town that all residents are proud to call home. But this small, picturesque town also has a deep stain left behind by a morbid crime committed back in 1971. Westfield became the town where the List family met its brutal fate. John Emil List, born September 17, 1925, was the son of John Frederick List and Alma Barbara Florence List, both of whom were descended from German immigrants and were evangelical Lutherans. At the time of John's birth, his father was already 66 years old and his mother was 38 years old. John E. List grew up in Bay City, Michigan, and lived with his parents who followed a strictly religious and moralistic way of life. As a result, he ended up having a tense relationship with them. John's father was not at all interested in raising him, and so the duty of bringing up John fell on his mother. Alma List, John's mother, made him attend church regularly and barred him from getting messy, doing anything even vaguely dangerous, or interacting with children Alma deemed unworthy. John was brought up in an extremely strict and conservative environment, which turned him into a repressed, neurotic young man who was not particularly well liked by his peers. By the time John turned 18, he enlisted himself in the U.S. Army in 1943, only a year prior to his father's death in 1944. John went on to serve during World War II and the Korean War. He returned home to work for an accounting firm and later on became a supervisor at a paper company. At the age of 26, in 1951, John met Helen Morris Taylor. Helen was the widow of Marvin Everett Taylor, a war hero who'd passed away earlier in 1951. She also had a daughter named Brenda Joyce Taylor with them. John and Helen quickly grew fond of each other, and within a month of them meeting, Helen told John that she was pregnant. They hastily got married the same year, and Helen's pregnancy scare turned out to be false. John also learned of Helen's health issues after their marriage. Helen had syphilis from her first husband, but wasn't contagious at the time she married John. After a somewhat rough start, John and Helen worked it out, settled in Michigan, and had their first child on January 8, 1955, a baby daughter. They named her Patricia Morris List, or simply Patty. Then, on October 21, 1956, they had a boy and named him John Frederick List after his grandfather, but his loved ones called him John Jr. After the birth of their third and last child, Frederick Michael List, on August 26, 1958, Helen developed an addiction to alcohol and antidepressants. She even started to disagree with John's religious lifestyle and stopped going to church.
John, when you go to church this Sunday, I want you to take my name off the membership rolls.
What did you say?
I don't care if you take the kids, you take my name off.
Around the same time, Helen's first daughter, Brenda, had gotten pregnant at the age of 16 and was sent away to a home for unwed mothers. With the hopes of turning things around for his family and keeping them happy, John decided to move to New Jersey and buy a mansion. He asked his mother to help him pay the mortgage for the mansion.
Mom, I can't afford it by myself. But with your $10,000, I can make the down payment. Please, Mama, help me.
Alma agreed, but on the condition that she too would move in with them. Even though Helen and Alma didn't see eye to eye and disapproved of each other, the thought of living in a mansion made them bury their differences. In 1965, the List family moved into a 19-room Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside, Westfield, New Jersey. They called it Breeze Knoll. John also bagged the position of vice manager at a nearby bank. On the outside, the List family was the ideal American family. John List taught Sunday school at the local church, and the family never missed a Sunday service. John was obsessed about maintaining his family's image in society. For once, after a long time, things were looking good for the List family. But this happiness for the List family was short-lived. It was the start of December in 1971 when the List family's neighbors grew suspicious after not seeing any of them for a month. There hadn't been any activity in or around the mansion either. The neighbors initially thought that the family was on vacation, but grew suspicious as all the lights in the mansion were switched on at all times and had now started to burn out. They became worried as doubts kept emerging and decided to inform the authorities on Tuesday, December 7th, 1971.
It's been a month. I've been keeping my eye on this place. One by one, the lights have been going out, and that music doesn't stop.
The police arrived shortly after, and a bunch of officers were looking around the mansion as the main door was locked and nobody was answering. They entered the mansion through an open window. The temperature inside was almost as low as it was outside. Church music was playing on full volume over the radio, and a foul smell of rotting flesh lingered throughout the mansion. Searching through the 19-room mansion, Officer Charlie Holler made a horrific discovery in the ballroom. The bodies of 47-year-old Helen, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John Jr., and 13-year-old Frederick were lying next to each other, resting on sleeping bags on the floor. All the bodies seemed to have been shot and had their faces covered.
He cleaned up a lot of the blood and had bags with bloody towels and rags. That's one thing you never forget. Something like that you never think would happen or you'd come upon. And it stuck with me for a long time.
The gruesome details of the List family murders resembled scenes pulled right out of a psychological thriller. Officer Charlie Holler had never seen such a disturbing sight in his career. He notified the other officers and continued to inspect the scene further. There were traces of blood leading to the kitchen, which was where the police found a blood-soaked mop and paper bags stuffed with bloody towels. The fifth body, Alma List, aged 84, was found in the attic on the third floor of the mansion. Her face had been covered with a towel. The police recovered the bodies of 5 members of the List family, but the 6th member, John List, was still missing. 2 handguns and a 5-page letter were found in John's room. The police also noticed something odd about all the family photos they found in the house. They had something in common. John's face had been cut out from all the pictures. There weren't any traces of John left behind, and he was nowhere to be found. Examining the trail of blood leading to the kitchen, the detectives concluded that the victims were murdered there and had their bodies dragged to the ballroom. The police sent all the bodies of the List family members for autopsy and started inspecting the physical evidence. The guns found at the crime scene were a 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and a .22 caliber revolver. The killer's fingerprints were obtained from the guns and preserved. The .22 caliber revolver belonged to John's father, and the handgun was purchased on October 14, 1971, by John under his name. This made the detectives think that maybe John had been planning this massacre for quite some time. Initially, they were confused whether John was a victim or the killer itself. But the letter found in John's room confirmed that he killed his family. The letter was written by John himself.
Kill your mother, your wife, and your 3 kids is beyond comprehension.
Anyone who knew John List all reacted the same way, that how could he have done this? Why did he do it?
It was addressed to the List family's pastor, Eugene A. Raywinkle, and was dated November 7, 1971. In the letter, John confessed to killing his own family members. He also mentioned the contact details of some relatives and acquaintances so the pastor could reach out and inform them about the incident.
I know what this must look like to you, but I want you to know that I took special care to be sure there was no pain. Well, he and the kids came to church every Sunday. He used to teach Sunday school.
John also stated that Helen and the kids had wanted to get cremated. In the letter, John asked the pastor to arrange for his family's funeral and keep the costs at minimum. When the police started questioning the neighbors of the List family, they learned that the family's perfect reputation was only a facade. What actually went on behind the mansion doors painted a completely different picture. The neighbors initially thought of the List family as an ideal American family that had it all. They were disciplined, moralistic, and religious, which were all perceived well by their neighbors when they'd first moved to the mansion. Soon, all the neighbors started to realize that the List family wasn't as perfect as they thought. The neighbors thought of them as an extremely religious family with strict morals, but also realized that they were antisocial and quite odd. John E. List in particular stood out for everyone. When a neighbor went to John to welcome him to the locality with a pie, John told him to his face that the List family was antisocial, but he still took the pie. John struck everyone in the locality as an odd and highly rude man. Some of the neighbors remembered seeing him mow the lawn wearing a tux on a hot summer day. This was observed by many on multiple occasions. One of Patricia's school friends told the police that one time, John disapproved of a t-shirt Patricia was wearing. He ripped the t-shirt off of Patricia while screaming at her. Patricia believed her father hated her. In a similar incident, one night Patricia was stopped by the police for wandering through the streets at nighttime with a friend. When John was called to go to the station and pick her up, his actions left his witnessing neighbors shaken. It was the middle of the night when John was called to the station. Even then, he dressed up in his tux before leaving. But his aggressive behavior towards Patricia was what stunned the neighbors. Patricia's drama coach, Ed Iliano, told the police that he'd met John List a few times when he disapproved of Patricia's interest in drama. He told them that John had a terrifying personality and gave sinister vibes. Once, Patricia had even told Ed that her father had threatened to kill the whole family after a particularly bad argument. These kinds of threats became more common, and at times, John would even ask his children whether they'd like to be cremated or be buried. After these revelations, the detectives realized that John had likely been planning these murders for quite a while. The investigation went on, and the detectives learned that the mail, newspaper, and milk services had already been halted by John. The List family hadn't attended church since November, and the school had been informed that the family was going on a vacation to tend to Helen's ailing mother. And that's why there were no signs that would draw anyone's attention toward the Breeze Knoll mansion. On Thursday, December 9, 1971, John's car was discovered parked near the John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. It was a Chevy Impala with a parking ticket dated November 10, 1971. The police thought that John might have taken a flight and probably fled the country, but there were no records of him taking a flight. The only thing the detectives were sure of was that wherever John was now, he'd had a 1-month head start. The autopsy reports came back, and it was confirmed that all the family members were killed with the gun found in John's room at the mansion. Everyone took a bullet to the head once, except John Jr. He was shot a total of 10 times across his head, neck, and chest. This left the officers confused as they wondered why John Jr. suffered a more torturous fate than the other family members. The funeral ceremony took place on November 12, 1971. Alma List was buried in St. Lawrence Lutheran Cemetery, Frankenmuth, Michigan, while Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were laid to rest in Fairview Cemetery, Westfield, New Jersey. Their tombstone read, "There is peace in the eternal valley." On the day of the funeral, many policemen roamed around the cemetery wearing plain clothes in the hopes that John would show up for the event. But he never did. The case was made a top priority by law enforcement, and they were determined to catch John List. His picture was circulated to every police station across the country for everyone to see. Time went on, but John's whereabouts were still a mystery. The detectives found it hard to believe that no police officer in the country had encountered John yet. A theory began circulating that John might have taken his own life out of guilt. Even after spending months trying to solve the case, the police could come up with no potential leads or evidence that would lead them to John. And with time, the case of the List family murders went cold. Years passed, and the original detectives who were handling the List family case retired. They left behind New Jersey's most morbid mystery for new detectives. By 1988, Captain Frank Maranka and Detective Bernard Tracy had taken up the case. The newly assigned investigators employed a fresh technique towards solving the case. In April 1988, a show called America's Most Wanted was making headlines covering cases from across the country.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted,
which kept everyone on the edge of their seats. The show, hosted by John Walsh, had the whole country hooked on it. Considering the show's reach and audience pool, Maranka and Tracy decided to approach the showmakers later in 1988.
One night watching TV, we watched America's Most Wanted.
If we were successful in getting the List case aired, someone out there would recognize him, would make that telephone call.
The creators of the show thought that John List's case had been lying cold for too long, and he was probably dead by now. But Maranka and Tracy didn't back down. They constantly kept asking the showmakers to air an episode on John List, and in April 1989, they finally agreed.
I said, this is a guy I'd like to see caught, and we decided to do John List.
The detectives teamed up with Frank Bender, a sculptor who had worked with police previously, helping them sculpt the faces of people whose bodies had decomposed before the police found them. All Frank needed was the skull of the body. But this case was different.
I had been involved in the battle for missing children's rights for years since the murder of my son in 1981, and I had come across Frank Bender over the years as a renowned forensic reconstruction artist.
Frank had to construct a sculpture of what John would look like now in 1989, using only a picture taken more than 18 years before. John took the case very seriously, as this was the first of its kind. He told the detectives that he wanted to know everything about John before he began making the sculpture.
I get into the head of the person. In a sense, I want to become that person while I'm working on The Fugitive. I want to feel like that person. I want to know everything about that person.
A forensic psychologist was assigned to help Frank draw up the psychological portrait of John.
Perpetrator has a history of frustration and feeling entrapped by women. Generally, women of their own age group or older, or women in authority.
Soon enough, they were able to make a sculpture of what John might presently look like in 1989. Although there was one detail they weren't sure of. They wondered whether John would have started wearing contact lenses or not. If not, what kind of glasses would he be wearing now? The psychologist on the case theorized that John would not be concerned enough about his appearance to swap his glasses for lenses. He also theorized that John might have changed his glasses and ended up with thick, dark, horn-rimmed glasses.
To look more intelligent, more important than he really was, and this was through the help of Richard Walter's profile.
Psychologists theorized that List would wear the same spectacles he wore as a younger man to remind him of his more successful days. The sculpture of what John would look like in the present was finally complete. John Walsh covered List's case on an episode that aired on May 21, 1989. John List was presented as the lead suspect, and every detail about him and his past was shared.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
Some 22 million Americans watched the episode, which not only broadcast John's photograph across the nation, but also featured a realistic bust showing what John was believed to look like now. The media, too, covered the recent developments in the case, and the word quickly spread across the country. After that, the police received over 200 tips about John from all over the country, but one stood out. In Denver, a woman named Wanda Flannery and her daughter, Eva Michelle, were watching the special episode on John List on America's Most Wanted. As the episode progressed and more details about John List were revealed, Wanda and Eva thought that John's description had a striking resemblance to their neighbor, Bob Clark. His entire profile matched John's. It was all starting to add up. Bob was an accountant, a Lutheran, simple dresser, well put together, had a quiet nature, and attended church regularly.
And it just all started adding up, that he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear. He was well put together, classy dresser.
By the time the episode got to the sculpture and saw how incredibly accurate it was, Wanda and Eva were confident that their neighbor was, in fact, John List.
By the time they got to the sculpture, and the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, oh my God, that's Bob, and Bob Clark.
Bob is John List.
On Thursday, June 1st, 1989, about 11 days after the episode on John List was aired on America's Most Wanted, Wanda called up the police and informed them about her suspicions toward Bob Clark. She told them that he'd been living in her neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, with his wife Dolores Miller, but had recently moved to Richmond, West Virginia. On the very same day, FBI agent Kevin August with his team barged into Bob's office in Richmond and asked him if he was Bob Clark.
I approached him and I asked him, I said, "Are you Mr. Clark?" And he said, "Yes." And then I said, "Are you John List?" And he says, "No, I'm Robert P. Clark."
The authorities were sure that he was lying, and after matching the fingerprints found on the gun at the crime scene in 1971 to Bob's, it was confirmed. Bob Clark was John List. John was arrested on June 1st, 1989 and taken into custody. The authorities were shocked by the accuracy of the sculpture. Everything, except for a few extra wrinkles, was an exact match to John's current appearance. The glasses he wore were the same ones the psychologist had predicted and chosen for the sculpture. When John was interrogated by the police, he finally revealed the truth behind the heinous crime and how it unfolded. Now, let's listen to the truth behind the bizarre story. The fresh start for the List family at Breeze Knoll turned out to be their worst nightmare. Their happiness there was short-lived. By 1971, John was struggling due to his job dealing with modern trends, something he lacked skills in.
I wasn't trained on computers. I was trained to use my brain, not a machine's brain.
Eventually, he ended up getting fired, but didn't tell his family about it. According to John, not being good at his job and not being able to provide for his family made him a failure. For months, he would simply dress up in his tux, have breakfast in the morning, and pretend to leave for work, when in reality, he'd go to the train station and spend the day there.
He would get dressed up in a suit and drive his car to the train station and take the train a few stops so people thought John List was still viably employed and he was doing well.
In the evening, upon his return, he'd tell Helen about his hectic day, have dinner and go to bed, only to wake up and repeat the same cycle the next day. John's parenting style, too, became more strict and cruel. Any step outside John's rules led to harsh punishments for his 3 children.
I've told each and every one of you this house is not a playground. Don't you listen to me anymore? This house is a sanctuary. Off the phone when I'm talking to you. Get off of the phone.
According to John, Patricia had started to dress provocatively, and John Jr. had started to talk back. John was bothered by his children's emerging sexuality and sense of freedom. The rebel in John's teenage kids had started to show, and it was unacceptable to John. He was also having a hard time paying the bills and mortgage for the mansion. He even resorted to secretly withdrawing money from his mother's bank account. Helen's addiction problems weren't getting any better either. She'd started to neglect her children and began seeing a psychiatrist. She even quit church, which added on to more expenses for John. Declaring bankruptcy or any financial downsizing would tarnish his family's image and would split the family apart, leading his children away from their strict Lutheran lifestyle. John was having a midlife crisis and didn't know how to deal with it. Instead of coming clean and asking his family for help, he chose the most horrible solution. John believed that his family was being corrupted by the modern ways of life and being diverted from the path God had intended them to be on. He thought that if they continued their lives disobeying him, they would be met by the devil and end up in hell. According to John, murdering his whole family, who was still in their innocence, would assure their safe arrival in heaven.
I kept thinking about it for several weeks, I'm sure, maybe even a month. My final solution was that if I would kill them, that would save them from any problems.
On Tuesday, November 9th, 1971, John brought his plan into action.
I felt that even though I killed the family, I could still get forgiveness eventually from God. Just got myself so convinced that this was what I had to do that I was going to go through with the whole program.
Around 9 a.m. when the children had left for school, Helen was sipping on her daily morning coffee by the window at the kitchen table.
I tried not to act any different than I ordinarily would, so they wouldn't be suspicious.
John snuck up behind her and shot her in the back of her head. The bullet went through Helen's head and shattered her jaw. She slowly fell to the ground. John moved her body from the kitchen to the ballroom and placed it on a sleeping bag. John then went up to the 3rd floor of the mansion where his mother was. Alma greeted John with a kiss and asked him about the noise. John replied by shooting her in the head as well.
She got over and greeted me and gave me a kiss. And she said, "What was that noise?" And I said, "Oh, it must have been some noise out in the back. That's why I came up." As she got to the doorway, I killed her.
He tried moving her body, but she was too heavy to move, so John left Alma's body in the hallway and covered her face with a towel. He didn't really want to kill Alma, but knew that she wouldn't be able to handle the trauma from what he was about to do. John then drove to the bank and closed both his and his mother's accounts. He then went to the post office and posted the letters to the kids' school informing them about the family leaving for a vacation. Around 1 p.m., John returned home and made himself a sandwich. As he waited for his children's arrival, the phone rang. It was the school nurse who asked John to pick Patricia up as she wasn't feeling well that afternoon. John picked Patricia up and drove her back home. He walked in first and hid behind the door. As soon as Patricia walked in and closed the door behind her, he shot her in the head. After that, John placed Patricia's body next to Helen's in the ballroom. Then it was Frederick's turn, who received the same fate as his mother and sister. When Frederick arrived home from school, he too was shot as soon as he entered the kitchen. John dragged his body and placed it on a sleeping bag in the ballroom. When it came to John Jr., things were quite different. John Jr. had a football match and would return home late that day. John List decided to drive to his eldest son's football game to cheer him on and watch him play.
So I went over and watched the soccer game. He seemed to be playing a good game and enjoying himself. And then we came home together in the car.
As the game was over, John drove John Jr. home and tried to shoot him, but he fought back and got shot in the neck. He was still alive. John couldn't bear to see his son in pain and shot 9 more bullets into his body to relieve him from the pain.
All the others, they just, dropped. So I knew they were dead. With John, I don't know whether it was a muscle reaction that caused him to jerk around a little bit, but then I shot several more times.
And just like that, it was all over. John then tried to clean up the crime scene. He made sure that all the bodies, except Alma's, were in the ballroom and resting on sleeping bags.
I think after I had shot John and cleaned up, I felt such a measure of relief that this plot that I had was carried out without being interrupted. I more or less relaxed after that.
Around 7 p.m., John made himself some dinner, recited some prayers for his family from the hymn book, and afterwards headed to bed.
Having been in combat, we were out killing and fighting, and then we'd come in and have something to eat. I think that's what allowed me to eat peacefully in the room that I had killed my family.
In John's mind, he had truly done an act of kindness for his family. He thought that taking his own life would bar him from going to heaven and reunited with his family. So he planned his escape.
I felt that if you committed suicide, you would automatically go to hell.
The next morning, on November 10th, 1971, John got dressed up and was ready to escape. He lowered the thermostat all the way down so the temperature inside would be freezing. He turned on all the lights and played church music on the radio on full volume. He did this to keep any intruders away.
I felt that if some intruder wanted to get into the house, that they might back off if they've heard music and thought that people were in the house.
Then John got in his car and drove to JFK International Airport. He parked his car there and with the $2,000 he had, took a train to Denver, Colorado. And that was when John List disappeared and Bob Clark emerged. John reached Denver and took up the fake identity of Bob Clark. He started working as a fry cook and maintained a low profile. When things cooled down and the police weren't on to John List, he eventually went back to his old life. John got himself an accountant job and started attending church again. In 1985, he married Dolores Miller, whom he met at the church, and settled down with her in a locality in Denver. John told Dolores that his first wife had died of cancer. Dolores believed him and fell in love with him, unaware of the fact that he was a mass murderer, until the day of reckoning arrived in 1989. Initially after his arrest, John List maintained his innocence and claimed that he was Bob Clark. But one day while he was in custody, a prison guard overheard him confessing his crimes to Dolores. The guard informed his seniors about the incident, and John's trial began. The defense tried to argue that John was in an unstable state of mind and was suffering from PTSD from the war. But the prosecution wasn't having it. They argued that John was merely having a midlife crisis and he should fully be held accountable for his actions. A psychologist even stated that John was in a cool state of mind while committing the heinous crime.
He made very elaborate plans to carry out the killings in a serial fashion. He did not want two of the family members to be present at the same time.
In May 1990, the judge was convinced by the prosecution, and John Emil List was charged guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To the end, John was cold and emotionless when recounting his crimes and giving his closing statement.
Sorry for the tragedy that happened in 1971. I feel that due to my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened.
John was then sent to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. It also turned out that before John's episode was aired, he himself was a fan of the show America's Most Wanted. He always wondered if there would ever be an episode about him, and there finally was. John spent the next and last 18 years of his life at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He ultimately died of complications from pneumonia at the St. Francis Medical Center on March 21, 2008. He was 82 at the time. Even till his last breath, John did not show any kind of remorse for his actions. Alma, Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick's chances to live their life to the fullest were snatched away from them. The children now lay in peace, with their mother watching over them. Dolores Miller, John's second wife, was truly shocked to learn of John's real identity. She couldn't bring herself to believe that the man she loved so much was a murderer. The event took an emotional toll on her and drove her into denial.
I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man.
The mansion in New Jersey where John List lived with his family burned down several months after the murders. Authorities never found the cause of the fire, and a new house was built on the property years later. The memory of the murders still haunts Westfield residents. In an interview in 2008, parents told a reporter in New Jersey that children will not walk past that property, nor do they even want to live on the same street. Do you think John turned out to be the person he was because of his extremely strict and religious childhood? Had the sculpture not been accurate, do you think John would have gotten away forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.